Let's bring in independent economist Saul Eslake now. Saul, great to see you. We saw Chris Minns having a little, complaint about GST carve-up in his media conference just ahead of the budget. We'll get to that. But first of all, this assumption that inflation is going to get back into the RBA's target band by the end of the year, how heroic is that assumption in your view?
Well, it depends what the government does in the budget to bring inflation down. We saw last year, for example, three of the things that were in the budget, namely the energy bill relief, the increase in Commonwealth rent assistance to pensioners and beneficiaries renting in private housing, and the increase in childcare subsidies, all provided some relief targeted to people who arguably needed it most, but also had a mechanical downward impact on those three components in the CPI. So if the government repeats those kind of measures again in the budget tomorrow night, I don't think they'll do anything more on childcare, but the gossip seems to be that there will be an extension of the energy bill relief, and they may do something on Commonwealth rental assistance as well. Then that will have a mechanical downward impact on inflation. It's important to note that the Reserve Bank said explicitly last week that its forecasts for inflation assumed the expiry of the energy bill relief and didn't make any provision for any measures to assist pensioners renting in private housing. So it is possible, depending on precisely what the government announces tomorrow night, that inflation could be lower than the Reserve Bank has forecast. It's a matter of weighing up the mechanical impact that these measures have on the CPI itself against whether the assistance is sufficiently tightly targeted to avoid exerting a material upward impact on spending and hence inflation. And we can't really be definitive in a judgment about that until we see exactly what the budget contains.
Yeah, that's right. I look forward to talking to you when we see the details, Saul. But when you look at the data coming through, I mean, retail spending is diabolical. Services inflation seems to be the sticky part of this, for want of a better term. And it's not discretionary spending, it seems to be essential services.
Well, those two things are pushing in opposite directions, of course. The weakness in retail sales is a disinflationary force because it suggests demand is weakening, and excess demand has been, and according to the Reserve Bank, still is a factor exerting upward pressure on inflation. So although it's not nice to see people having to cut back spending, whether it's on discretionary items or essential, that's part of the path back towards acceptably low inflation. On the other hand, services inflation, and in particular housing inflation, and within that in particular rents, is a source of persistently higher than desirable inflation. There's not a lot that the government can do about housing inflation except through measures such as increases in the Commonwealth rent assistance payment to pensioners who are renting privately. So if they do that, that is targeted at people who genuinely need it, and it does have a mechanically favourable impact on inflation as measured in the CPI. So that could be a factor that justifies the government forecasting lower inflation than the Reserve Bank, which, to repeat, explicitly said last week that it hadn't allowed for any measures like that in its forecast of inflation.
The special GST deal for WA, you've called it one of the worst public policy decisions of the 21st century. We saw Chris Minns just before talking about that. Any hope that there's any rectification in this budget, Saul?
No, sadly. Even though it was interesting that the debate I had with him at the press club last week, Colin Barnett, who was the former Premier of Western Australia, one of the instigators of this dreadful decision, actually said, and I commend him for it, that Western Australia's share didn't really need to be lifted to 75% of what it would have obtained under a notional per capita distribution, as it will be in the 24-25 financial year. I wish the federal government would take note of that. If the federal government wants to find a way of tackling the longer-term deficit problem, which it still has, and which Tuesday's budget will again show that after the current financial year, there are deficits as far as the eye can see. One very obvious way of reducing those deficits would be to cut the $5 billion a year of additional money that's going to Western Australia, so that Western Australia can run big budget surpluses, so big that they have to resort to accounting tricks like giving their GBEs a dividend holiday to make their surpluses look smaller. And as we also saw in Western Australia's budget on Thursday, they've got so much money coming out there is they can afford to throw money around at people irrespective of their need for it, under the guise of cost of living relief. I mean, what this dirty deal is doing is allowing ultimately Western Australians, citizens of the richest state in the country, richer by a bigger margin than any other state has ever been in Australia's history as a nation, to have better public services and lower state taxes than everybody else, which runs totally counter to the principle that has underpinned the distribution of federal money to states and territories since the 1930s. But unfortunately, that's not going to be undone, because the Labor government knows that it needs to retain all the seats that it won in Western Australia at the 2022 election if it's to have any chance of avoiding becoming a minority government. And likewise, the coalition knows they have to win some of those seats which they lost in WA back if they're to have any chance of returning to government after the next election. And so, sadly, the narrow partisan political interests of both major parties in the federal parliament are trumping, and I use that word deliberately, trumping the national interest in a fair distribution of Commonwealth money among the states and territories.
Yep, you took the words out of my mouth, Saul. We'll wait to see the budget. We look forward to talking to you after. See you soon.
Thanks very much for having me.